One of the most controversial technological changes of our time is the rise of artificial intelligence. This one set of technological innovations has immense practical implications. With AI, we can do things otherwise unimaginable prior to the rise of AI. Very few tools currently available to humans are as powerful or more powerful than AI. Unfortunately, such a reality also has a downside. Like with previous technological advances, AI will inevitably make certain jobs obsolete. The thing is, AI has the potential to do this on a much larger scale than the automation of factories or the invention of more efficient farming technology. How are we, in the most general terms, deal with the socio-economic effects of this? How do we deal with the socio-economic effects of job obsolescence in an already fragile economic context? Another, scarier implication, one that appears to come right out of sci-fi, is what happens if AI happens to reach a level of cognitive capacity equal to or greater than that of humans, or even becomes conscious. How do we maintain control over our technology or prevent AI from hurting or oppressing us?
I'll be back.
Yet, AI has also raised a series of interesting scientific and philosophical questions. Can machines, or inanimate objects more generally, ever be said to be intelligent or conscious? Can intelligence or consciousness ever be replicated in a machine? If so, what is the technological or mechanical process by which this can be done? Yet, even if the technology is there, do we understand the nature of intelligence or consciousness or how the brain works sufficiently enough to replicate brain activity or cognition in a machine? Some people believe that intelligence and consciousness can be replicated in a machine, while others reject such a view. Both stances presuppose a specific definition of intelligence or consciousness, whether it be precise and relatively sophisticated or only vague and broadly defined. How we define intelligence and consciousness is something that cuts across the realms of brain science, biology, psychology, philosophy, and even religion. Philosophical debates surrounding AI are just as intense as some of the more practical social and economic debates surrounding this technology. I'm currently enrolled in a PhD program, and my main area of focus is the philosophical and more specifically epistemological implications of AI. In this video, I hope to provide a brief overview of my research on a specific aspect of this debate. In particular, I have done quite a bit of research on the thought of a specific philosopher who has spoken a lot about the philosophical implications of AI, the American-born philosopher John Searle. In particular, I have done some research not only on Searle's response to certain philosophical positions concerning AI, but also his broader epistemology. And I've done a lot of research on the similarities and differences between Searle's epistemology and that of one of my theological heroes, St. Thomas Aquinas. In this video, I hope to outline Searle's philosophical approach to AI, whether or not his broader epistemology upholds or undermines his approach, and how the epistemology of St. Thomas Aquinas in specific compensates for some of the problems that we find in Searle. Before we get into it, let's first define our terms. In his writings on AI, Searle was responding more specifically to a philosophical position called strong AI. In the philosophical study of AI, there are two broad schools of thought: weak AI, also known as soft AI, and hard AI, also known as strong AI. The weak AI position states that machines can imitate certain elements of human cognition and therefore give us some valuable insights concerning the nature and operation of human cognition, but cannot imitate the full range of human cognition. The strong AI position, on the other hand, asserts that intelligence can be fully replicated in a machine, and that machine intelligence may even one day be able to supersede human intelligence. The seeds of the strong AI position go back to the early 1950s with the British-born mathematician and computer scientist Alan Turing, who asserted that if we were to ask a machine a question, and the machine were to produce answers that, on the surface, are indistinguishable from those given by a human, then this would prove that the machine-based forms of information processing are fundamentally identical to that of humans. This eventually gave rise to a broader philosophical position that the core element of cognition is computation, and that if we could sufficiently understand the mechanics of how computation occurs in living organisms, we could create a machine that imitates this. As computer technology developed over the ensuing decades, the strong AI position was elaborated, and as computer technology, robotics, and eventually AI became ever more sophisticated and capable of performing ever more advanced tasks or engaging in ever more complex forms of information processing, such a view became more widely accepted. In 1980, the American philosopher John Searle published an article titled Minds, Brains, and Programs, in which he critiqued the underlying philosophical assumptions of strong AI. Searle argued that syntax is insufficient for semantics, that is, a knowledge of the logical or grammatical relationship between symbols, that is, syntax, was insufficient to establish a conceptual knowledge of the meaning of these symbols, that is to say, semantics. Yet, since the forms of information processing typically associated with AI and computer programs more generally are purely syntactic in nature, it is not truly intelligent, since intelligence requires a knowledge of both syntax as well as semantics. Against this view, some have argued that language is essentially contextual. That is, the manner in which words are used is just as fundamental, if not more fundamental, than the definition or conceptual content of the words in determining their meaning. Since AI understands the logical and grammatical relationship between pieces of information or the symbols by which they are communicated, that is, how words relate to their context, AI can be said to have some understanding of the information it receives. The core of this criticism is that the meaningfulness of language has as its ultimate basis the manner in which it is used and how it relates to its larger context. For instance, there may be more than one meaning attached to a smoke signal or a logical symbol, yet we know that such ways of communicating are meaningful based on the context within which they are used. Thus, semantics is not irrelevant. Rather, some critics of Searle have called into question the notion that semantics is more fundamental than syntax, rather than asserting that semantics is reducible to syntax. Against this, Searle has argued that visible symbols or spoken words, as physical things, lack any inherent meaning. Meaning is not something contained within the physical symbols or sounds that constitute language. Rather, meaning is something attached to the symbols or sounds by the observer. Seeing a symbol or hearing a sound, or even seeing a pattern in terms of how symbols or sounds are used or how they relate to one another, tells us nothing about their meaning. Rather, symbols are meaningful insofar as we are told the definition or the object that serves as its reference, and thus associates the meaning with the word whenever we hear it. Searle exemplified this stance in a thought experiment he put forward in his article, Minds, Brains, and Programs. Imagine if someone who doesn't speak a word of Chinese is kidnapped and brought to China, where they're locked in a room with no interaction with the outside world, and they're tasked with writing proper responses to certain texts. Someone enters a locked room, gives them a piece of paper with a Chinese symbol on it, and expects them to write a proper response. Now, this person doesn't know Chinese at all. They don't know how to pronounce the words. They don't know what the words mean. They don't know their proper grammatical usage. They know literally nothing. All they have to help them is a book that, on one side of the page, contains a series of Chinese symbols, and on the other side of the page, a series of other Chinese symbols that serve as the proper response. So whenever this person receives a piece of paper and is expected to write the proper response, they look up the Chinese symbol in the book, find which other symbol serves as the proper response, and write it down. After doing this for a certain amount of time, this person comes to memorize all the Chinese symbols and which other Chinese symbols serve as the proper response to it. Just because you've memorized a series of symbols and know what other symbols serve as the proper response, that is, just because you've memorized what the symbols look like and how they relate to one another, does that mean you truly understand Chinese? No, of course not. Best case scenario, someone would say that you do understand Chinese on a very basic level, but wouldn't necessarily be considered fluent. A person is said to truly understand a language if they understand not just the symbols that constitute the language and how they relate to one another, but also their meaning. All of this is, in general, an overview of Searle's response to strong AI. Searle's philosophical response to strong AI is, in many ways, reflective of his views on the philosophy of language and the more practical elements of epistemology. Nonetheless, his thoughts on the questions that arise from AI, how do humans discern meaning? What is the relationship between meaning and the various ways meaning is communicated? Can meaning ever be comprehended by inorganic entities? Raises a lot of questions on his broader epistemology, that is, his more fundamental views on the nature of the human mind and human thought. We will now move forward to speaking of John Searle's view on epistemology more generally and how his more general epistemic stance relates to his views on AI. And then we'll conclude our discussion by discussing whether his views on the human mind bolster or undermine his critique of AI. John Searle sees his view on the human mind as being a middle ground between dualism and some of the more simplistic forms of materialism. Dualism is the belief that the mind, that is, that which serves as the basis of thought and consciousness, is an immaterial reality distinct from but somehow united to the body. Searle believes that dualism is not only evidentially unfounded, but also unnecessarily complicates the philosophical and scientific questions concerning the mind body problem. Nonetheless, Searle also believes that most forms of materialism, materialism being the belief that the mind is not something fundamentally distinct from the brain as a physical thing, view consciousness as an afterthought. It attempts to explain the mechanisms of how the brain works, and then attempts to cram consciousness into that, sometimes even going as far as asserting that consciousness is purely illusory. Searle accepts what he sees as a common sense approach to the mind body problem, one that takes seriously the reality of consciousness or the first person perception of reality and uses that as the starting point for his philosophy of mind without trying to explain consciousness or the mind in terms of immaterial realities asserted on evidentially baseless grounds. Searle's view is that while mental states are distinct from physical states, that is, the various states that the brain, as a physical organ, exists in, cause mental states. This may sound like an interesting, unexpected, or even confusing view. In order to understand what Searle is trying to get at, we need to look at what he's responding to. Searle's view has been described as a form of causal reductionism, which is distinct from the position of ontological reductionism. Causal reductionism is merely the notion that thing A is caused by thing B, or that the existence of thing A is somehow rooted in thing B. Ontological reductionism, on the other hand, states that a thing is reducible to its lowest common ontological elements. Within the context of the mind-body problem, ontological reductionism states that mental states are indistinguishable from the physical states of the brain. To understand the physical or biological is to understand the mental, because the neurological or the psychophysiological on the one hand, and on the other hand, the cognitive and the phenomenological, are one and the same. Some who support this line of reasoning have taken such a view to its most extreme conclusion and state that because nothing exists beyond the material realm, And since consciousness or the subjective first-person awareness of reality are not in themselves physical, they are just illusory. Searle sees the notion that the mental and the physical are not distinct, or the notion that consciousness is just an illusion, as problematic. They're problematic because they are self-evidently wrong. We are conscious. We have some awareness of the nature of reality. And therefore, it makes no sense to say that consciousness is just an illusion. At the same time, he also believes that dualism is problematic because it asserts, without evidence, that there is something beyond the physical or biological that causes or contributes to cognition or consciousness. The only causal explanation for consciousness or cognition that we know of is biological in nature, that is, the various processes that take place within the brain. Yet, just because the causal basis of consciousness or cognition is the brain, doesn't mean that the mental is ontologically reducible to the physical, that is, that the mental and the biological are not distinct, or that consciousness is just an illusion. One analogy often used by Searle is that the relationship between the mind and the brain is akin to the relationship between water and its quality of wetness. The fact that water is wet or has the capacity to exhibit this quality is the direct causal result of its chemical makeup. Yet simply by examining its chemical makeup, that is, the arrangement of atoms or molecules in water, we don't directly perceive its wetness. Wetness is a quality of water that we encounter when examining water on a higher ontological order than simply the combination of its individual parts, though the former is caused by the latter. The problem with such a view is that if mental states can be produced by physical things, such as the brain, why can't anything physical, like a computer program or an artificially intelligent robot, also produce a mind? Searle's epistemology leaves open this possibility. According to Searle's epistemology, the notion of conscious or intelligent AI is not an absolute metaphysical impossibility, but is only impossible given the current limitations on AI. If one's opposition to the strong AI movement is rooted in the notion that strong AI is definitionally impossible, then from such a perspective, Searle's approach is self-defeating. His arguments against strong AI show why AI, as it currently stands, cannot be truly intelligent. Nonetheless, his view on the nature of the mind does not exclude the possibility that one day an AI-based piece of machinery may be developed that can directly imitate the functions of the human brain and therefore produce a rational and conscious mind. For those who, like myself, are more Thomistic in their bent, strong AI is not only impossible or unlikely given the current state of AI, but, based on the very nature of the mind, is a definitional impossibility. Now, in order to understand why this is the case, you have to understand the Thomistic view on the nature of the mind. In order to understand the Thomistic view on the mind, you have to understand the Thomistic understanding of the soul. For St. Thomas Aquinas, the soul is the ontological form of a living thing. That is to say, matter is the physical material stuff out of which a thing is made, and form is that which orders or arranges the matter in such a way so that it has an intelligent, coherent structure to it. The soul, on the other hand, is that which orders and arranges matter in such a way that it has all of the qualities of a living thing. Matter and form, and thus the soul and the body, are both conceptually and ontologically distinct. Yet for the most part, matter and form, even though they are distinct, are so closely linked that the destruction of the matter also leads to a destruction of the form. For instance, if I destroy a house, the form of the house doesn't remain. The same is true with the soul. Each part of the soul, argues St. Thomas Aquinas, lays the basis for, or makes possible, a certain quality or faculty of the body. Yet the soul, as that which organizes and arranges and therefore enlivens the body, is so closely linked with the body so as to be inseparable from it. Thus, when the body dies, so do most parts of the soul. The only exception, the angelic doctor asserts, is that part of the soul that makes possible reason. Reason is a form of knowing, yet it is a form of knowing that, unlike the senses, allows us to understand intelligible realities. That is, non physical or immaterial realities that undergird, unite, and organize the physical realm. No physical thing can understand purely intelligible parts of reality. For instance, by which sense organ do we understand moral truth? By what sense organ do we engage in spiritual pursuits? What is the sense organ that allows us to comprehend the basic laws of logic and metaphysics? All of this implies, for St. Thomas Aquinas, that the mind can be identified with the rational faculty of the soul, but that the mind more specifically is not material, and that further it is irreducibly immaterial, that is, of any physical thing or process, and that it is not, at its root, ontologically identical to anything material. As St. Thomas Aquinas notes in the Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, question 78, article 1, Respondeo, quote, I answer that there are 5 genera of powers of the soul, as above numbered. Of these, 3 are called souls, and 4 are called modes of living. The reason of this diversity lies in the various souls being distinguished accordingly as the operation of the soul transcends the operation of the corporeal nature in various ways. For the whole corporeal nature is subject to the soul, and is related to it as its matter and instrument. There exists therefore an operation of the soul which so far exceeds the corporeal nature that it is not even performed by any corporeal organ. And such is the operation of the rational soul. Below this there is another operation of the soul, which is indeed performed through a corporeal organ, but not through a corporeal quality. And this is the operation of the sensitive soul. For though hot and cold, wet and dry, and other such corporeal qualities are required for the work of the senses, yet they are not required in such a way that the operation of the senses takes place by virtue of such qualities, but only for the proper disposition of the organ. The lowest of the operations of the soul is that which is performed by a corporeal organ, and by virtue of a corporeal quality. Unquote. Insofar as a computer is not a living thing, it lacks a soul. Or, to put it in more precise philosophical terms, insofar as a computer has a specific order or structure to it, it has an ontological form, but insofar as it isn't living, it lacks that specific type of ontological form that St. Thomas and the broader Thomistic tradition after him would call a soul. Because it is not living, we can cast some serious doubt as to whether or not a computer can ever have consciousness or rationality. The reason why some proponents of the strong AI tradition may be open to this as a possibility is because they will point out that certain cognitive processes unique to humans or living things more generally have already been replicated in AI. There is a twofold problem with the view that just because some cognitive processes have been replicated in AI, that all of them will be replicated in AI. Namely, those cognitive processes present in or which define AI are those most intimately connected with the physical processes connected to brain activity. They aren't irreducibly immaterial in nature, and therefore, given the right physical conditions, can be replicated in a machine. Reason, however, is not merely a more complex form of information processing. It includes the capacity for abstraction, something intimately connected with the first-person subjective awareness of the object of our knowledge. It includes a knowledge of something more than just pieces of information or the connections between them. It, more relevant to our discussion, includes a knowing of things that are not, strictly speaking, material in nature, a knowledge that is off limits to those forms of cognition, such as sense, that are physiologically based. These forms of quitative Abstractive or rational knowledge are therefore not things that physical realities can give rise to, and which therefore cannot be replicated in purely physical entities. Yet, if physical states give rise to mental states, as Searle argues, why can't a machine one day be able to have mental states? Why can't a machine be developed that has the capacity for subjective observation, and therefore the ability to attach semantic meaning to purely syntactical realities, such as symbols, grammatical relations, etc.? Thus, for those who subscribe to at least the basic elements of Thomistic anthropology and epistemology, strong AI is a definitional impossibility. I think a broad set of principles, not directly connected to AI, but still connected to a closely related notion, namely the creation of machines that don't simply have intelligence, but life, sheds light on this. The philosopher Juan Carreño wrote an article on the notion of artificial life, and critiqued the notion of artificial life from a Thomistic perspective. He asserted that, from a metaphysical perspective, life is not merely the result of a specific set of qualities or faculties, but an underlying metaphysical structure that exists on a substantial or essential level and thus makes life possible. This is what is lacking in supposedly quote unquote living machines. There is thus a distinction between living things and things that imitate life, or certain specific qualities associated with life. Carreño thus argues against an overly reductionistic view of the nature of life that I would say is also true with regard to the concept of intelligence. Thus, I would say, in conclusion, that questions relating to AI are never simply about the technological capabilities and limits of AI. Rather, insofar as AI represents an attempt to replicate one of the most important and one of the most complex and ill understood elements of human life, namely intelligence, in a machine, our response to AI is directly determined by our understanding of the nature of the human mind. A more materialist view of the mind, which sees cognition and consciousness as nothing more than the product of certain physical processes in the brain, may be, at least in principle or on a philosophical level, more inclined towards the strong AI position. On the other hand, those who believe that the mind is incorporeal, that is, that the ontological basis of intelligence or consciousness is something immaterial, are less philosophically inclined towards the hard AI position. A Thomistic understanding of strong AI and the accompanying metaphysical and anthropological presuppositions that go along with this are not compatible with the conclusions of strong AI, and I would argue, for those who reject or are skeptical of the strong AI position, it represents a philosophically robust framework for the critique of the strong AI position. It avoids the pitfalls of both Cartesian dualism as well as Searlean materialism, while also creating a vision that allows us to demonstrate why the strong AI position is false or, at best, unlikely, not just based on the current state of things, but definitionally. Yet the most important question to be asked is whether we are willing to create a support or critique of AI that is consistent with our vision of the mind, since any attempt to address the questions of AI that are either not in line with or don't take into consideration our response to the philosophical questions concerning the nature of the mind are, at the end of the day, when looked at from the largest level, inconsistent or even incoherent.